Burnout isn't caused by bad leaders, but it is caused by well-intentioned leadership behavior under too much pressure. So, as a leader, you might feel like you're doing a good job, but if you're struggling to manage yourself and your own stress response, the way you interact with your team and lead them could unintentionally be causing more burnout. And that's just because you have so much going on and you're under so much stress. You see, burnout rarely comes from cruelty. It comes from cultural signals, just signaling that the current systems in the organization are not working well. Because teams don't burn out from work alone, they also burn out from how work is led. Having worked in leadership for many years, I have felt this, right? And in another video, we'll talk about that mid-level leadership squeeze that, and then I've experienced that too and walked alongside people. But one of the challenges as a leader is you have the pressure coming down from the top, right? Which is what guides the work. It guides what you expect from employees and how they get the work done. And what comes down from the top is part of what leads to burnout because of how the work is led, right? In the healthcare field, insurance and laws dictate so much about how we in the healthcare work. And the biggest challenge there is there's this backwards expectation of more effort into documentation, which is less time with the patients, right? Well, that also creates a lack of continuity of care because then there's not enough emphasis on what that patient truly needs. And that's where it's how's the work led, right? Is it about the patient? Is it about the staff? Or is it about everything that crosses the T's and dots the I's? And this is where it becomes more about patterns, not just personalities. You see, sometimes as leaders, we can have blind spots because leaders are usually so focused on optimization for results, but they don't often pay attention to capacity, right? When we talk about capacity, it's how much can the employee do? How much energy do they have to accomplish the things that maybe you want them to accomplish? And that's not just one employee from another, that can be across the organization too. Does the organization have the capacity to say, take on this new contract, right? We have to pay attention to all of these things because stress cascades downward faster than the strategy. So if leaders are stressed and trying to come up with the strategies, the employees who are doing a lot of the direct work are going to feel that stress. We feel what other people feel, right? We can listen to what they're saying, but as humans, we feel things a lot quicker. And so we have to pay attention to that. And what leaders tolerate does become the culture. So as a leader, if you're tolerating employees who are very negative, it affects the whole culture. And I had one time a individual I was supervising who became very volatile towards me, saying things that were not true, saying things out of emotion, out of anger. And my hands were tied, right? I wasn't allowed to do anything other than I just kept documenting, doing everything necessary that I could. But what happened in these situations is the rest of my staff would hide in their offices. They wouldn't socialize a lot. The mood and the energy just kind of settled into this, oh great, what's going to happen at work now? And I've seen this experience a few times, right? Where one person who, for whatever is causing the anger and the upset, and they're struggling to regulate and communicate effectively, it tanks the whole culture, and then nobody wants to be there. And as leaders, we have to pay attention to this. we have to do what we can to make sure the culture stays positive and resilient and work through these problems so they don't infest the whole culture and the whole organization. High performers do tend to also get more work done. And if they're not protected, meaning their time isn't protected, or we keep adding more to their plate because they're a high performer, they are going to burn out quicker. And oftentimes they burn out quietly until they've hit the end point. And as a leader, you have no idea because burnout shows up quietly. Most people are going, I just need to rest this weekend, or I just need to start eating better. And that's all good and that's all beneficial. But if our organizational system is not shifting, burnout will continue to grow and it's becoming a systemic issue where close to 75% of the people in the workforce, because, and I say workforce because every data point I have researched, it is that high in the healthcare field, in the tech field, in the education field, like every field has a 50 to 75% burnout rate. And high functioning teams are going to burn out quicker because they are high functioning. They always go, go, go. They don't slow down. And so as leaders, we need to help protect that. And so let's talk a little bit more about the specific leadership behaviors that do drive burnout. So as a leader, do you tend to approach everything with this sense of chronic urgency without allowing recovery time and windows? And what I mean by that is there are times where it's a crisis situation, right? Especially if we're talking about in the healthcare field. We have true urgent crises we have to jump and deal with, and we need our staff to do the same thing. But does that unintentionally lead to we create an urgency in every situation? Because I've seen that too, right? And the truth is, not everything is urgent, and we have to define that urgency. So we have to be careful we don't turn everything into a now mentality, right? And I think that's where we start to treat everything urgent, is expecting and treating any need for information, any situation that comes up, like we need the response this moment. And so we need to work on that. We have to be cautious that as leaders, are we praising people for being available more than we're praising their effectiveness of what they're actually doing? Because what we praise is what people are going to strive to do more of. And we want people who are doing work effectively, not just giving more hours because that's what we're praising and expecting. So we need to be cautious of what type of praise and how we're praising. What about having inconsistent priorities and last minute pivots, right? So if as a leader, you're not consistent in what you're expecting your staff to prioritize, they're constantly left guessing. And the more they're guessing, the more their stress response sits on alert, the more their nervous system is going, now what's coming, right? And yes, I know we have these last minute pivots. They always happen. It sometimes just comes with the nature of the job you do. And as leaders, you're probably good at those last minute pivots. But how much of that are you putting on your employees, right? That leads to that constant second guessing, that inconsistency and that questioning, what's going to come now? What am I going to have to deal with today? Because not everybody can handle those kind of things, and we need to pay attention to that. What about emotional offloading onto teams? Right, I recognize as leaders, we want to have some kind of relationship with the people we supervise and we work with. And that's important in order to get the job done, right? We need to cooperate with them, hopefully get along with them, even be somewhat friendly. And that can lead us into a trap of sharing too much of the emotional toll of being a leader onto the team, right? As a leader, it's partly our job to protect them from some some of the stuff coming down and some of the stuff going on. We carry a little bit more burden than they might, but paying attention to how much are you unintentionally offloading your emotional struggles about the job onto them. Because yes, they can feel it, but just be cautious there. And we have to be careful that silence is not a form of clarity. We have to have constant communication. We have to share changes. And I know sometimes as leaders, when there's not specific clear direction from higher ups or from when we know laws and rules are changing, there's not clarity yet. There's this mentality of, I'm not going to say anything to my team until I know the answers. And I want to caution on that because that can lead, and I've seen it many times, it leads to mistrust. I have heard people say over and over again, Deidre, I just want to know what's coming. I want to be able to prepare. I understand that there's not clarity in 100% of the direction we're headed or what the expectations will be. But I just want to know what's going on, because if we're talking about when rules change in healthcare, people are paying attention. They're not just waiting for leaders, they're paying attention. So they like the information so they can kind of be preemptive, right? But as leaders, we tend to use silence as a way to try to protect them. So we have to be careful what's the intent of our silence. And oftentimes these behaviors that we as leaders can show, and I include myself because I've been at fault a time or two, is that the more I fall into some of these behaviors that might burn my team out, I'm probably burning out myself, right? As leaders, we put so much effort into the job and what we're doing and helping support our staff and making sure the organization's moving forward that we don't always pause to think about how are things affecting us as an individual. And that's important because we can and probably will burn out first. And some of that tends to come from organizations that reward outcomes. So I've seen organizations who don't focus on sustainability. All they care about is the outcome, right? Are we hitting our financial bottom line? Are we hitting our metrics that we're measuring and getting those outcomes? And don't mishear me, because those are 100% important. But if we're not focused on stability of our workforce, then we are burning out even more. Burning out as leaders, burning out as a team, and as an organization. When these behaviors continue to persist, we're also going to see short-term performance that starts to affect long-term health. This really hit home for me because as a leader, I went from doing really well. I was making a lot of progress health-wise. I was loving my job, to not being able to physically walk very far, all because of burnout, because of what the job as a leader did to me. And it wasn't just being in leadership, it was the nature of what was going on in the field at the time. And so we have to be cautious that we're not solely focused on that short-term performance. We have to keep in mind that long-term health and that longevity, because we want people to stay in the workforce. I know personally, and as a therapist, I don't want to keep seeing people take time off because of burnout. That's not good for them. That's not good for the organization. And it can cause more stress. Oftentimes we have feedback loops that don't focus on capacity. It actually strains capacity, right? So higher expectations, we just overload people more. But do they really have the capacity to be efficient and stay for the long haul? I think turnover rates in the healthcare field, behavioral health in particular, tends to be about every 5 years. People move on. And that to me doesn't speak to sustainability or longevity for organizations to constantly have this turnover. And we're also going to end up normalizing behaviors and stress, right? Where we go, oh, that's just normal. That's just how the leader is. That's how that's just how things are. We just have to deal with it. Nothing should be normalized if we don't have sustainable systems and we're just burning people out. Because this impacts the culture, right? We talked about the culture earlier, but specifically the team culture. Psychological safety is gone. It just erodes. Because if people don't feel safe, they're not going to keep doing the job. They're going to pull back, they're going to retreat, and they're going to hide. And if cultures aren't functioning together because they're not safe, they're not going to progress. We're going to see certain initiatives decline in compliance, right? So people are going to try to comply, but they're not going to take initiative. So they're going to do the bare minimum. And you're going to see this across culture. Once it affects culture, it's pretty rampant. Errors will increase, meaning if people have brain fog and they can't make decisions and they're exhausted, the errors they do are higher because they're stuck in fight or flight mode. They're not being effective. And in the end, engagement will fall, which means they're just going to, again, pull back. They're not going to want to be there. And it is pretty common to see high performers who exit the company first because they're burnt out. They've hit their end. They can't take on anymore. And they struggle with being supported as an organization, as a leader. We have to support teams, right? Because when burnout hits the culture, teams are just surviving, they're not innovating, which means new ideas are not coming about. Fresh ways of getting things done, maybe more efficiently, are not going to happen. So we have to be cautious that we're not setting people up to fail, because that's what a broken system is doing. And so, what do leaders do differently that starts to reduce burnout? And I think this is a great source of conversations, right? And this is really where we need to go. And first and foremost, as a leader, are we setting realistic priorities and protecting people's focus time? So, meaning, what are the priorities I put out to my team? What has to be focused on and what isn't necessarily essential to keeping the organization moving forward? When we want to protect focus time, we have to cut back on and identify what is urgent and what is not, right? Are you expecting your team to respond to emails within an hour all day long? Or do you expect them to respond at least once, where they can decide where that best fits in their workload in their day, right? So how are we protecting that focus? Because some jobs, especially in the healthcare field, if we're doing documentation, constant interruptions makes getting that documentation done difficult, and it's not done to the best of our ability. As leaders, are we modeling recovery and boundaries? I've had and seen numerous times where employees adapt to what their leader does, and we don't always notice this, right? So, for example, and I think I mentioned this in a previous video, where we had built in this dedicated paperwork time for staff, and it happened, we tried it on like a Friday, right? End your week, finish your documentation so you can go into the weekend without having to come into work, or knowing that your work is done. And as a leader, yes, we do more and we probably work more hours. That comes with the position. Well, there might have been one week here and there where maybe I was directed to take the day off. And so I leave. And then what happens? There's no oversight. Staff don't stick around. They follow suit, which can be both good and bad, right? Because if I'm modeling taking recovery time, I want them to do it. But it's how do we portray that and how do we support it? Because if it's to get documentation done, I'm not going to support the recovery time, but we'll figure out how to build it in otherwise. And boundaries, right? I talked about boundaries in other videos that it's important. Like nobody's going to protect time. Nobody's going to protect my needs but me, right? Because the organization looks out for the organization. And so for me to do what's necessary for the organization, I got to work on those boundaries. We can also make sure that we are communicating clearly when the pressure is high. So we have to slow down communication sometimes. We have to think through, what am I communicating? What do I have to communicate? And how am I going to do that so people can hear? Because if their stress is high, they're also not going to hear it as clear as you want them to. So we have to work on those aspects when pressure's high. And it's time that we start to normalize capacity conversations, meaning each person is different and the load each person can accomplish and carry is different. And we need to look at what that capacity is individually and then organizationally. It can't just be about, are you at work doing your job for 40 hours or whatever the contract says, right? We need to look at that capacity. And we want to start measuring sustainability along with performance, right? So are people sustaining, or are they starting to take too much time off work? Are they enjoying coming to work, and do they want to stick around for a long time? These are all things that we want to start looking at. And so as an organization, we want to start recognizing and measuring these patterns that lead to burnout before they become visible. We want to catch them when they're invisible so that we recognize what's starting to change. And so if you're wondering where your organization's at when it comes to burnout, check out the organizational burnout assessment I have at burnoutbasics.com/org quiz. This is a great tool to help you just diagnose and recognize and understand what's going on in your organization. It's not blaming anybody or anything. It's just looking at systematically what's going on in the organization, right? This assessment will show where leadership systems are unintentionally driving burnout. It's going to help you start to explore which areas do we need to measure and start looking at. Because remember, burnout isn't about weak teams. It's about protecting your teams that you have. It's about leadership behaviors that set nervous system tone of the organization, how we function individually and how we function as a team. So start with the assessment, because leadership doesn't just drive results, it drives resilience.